In today's video, we'll be explaining what actually happened to everyone from Vault 22. But before we talk about dwellers infected by disgusting fungal spores, we need to talk about the scientists who brought those spores into the vault in the first place, because it's more important than you think. Original purpose. Vault 22 was created well before the Great War, with a specific goal: to answer the question, is it possible to find a way to combat the world's food shortages? However, after the nuclear apocalypse, the need to find new, more resilient and productive forms of sustenance became increasingly pressing. With the soil contaminated by high levels of radiation, most plants and animals could become extinct. The few that manage to survive and adapt will certainly undergo unpredictable mutations and may no longer be useful in feeding the human population of the future. Furthermore, it will be impossible to predict how long it would take for the outside world to become truly livable again. What would the vault dwellers eat for all those years? And perhaps decades? A new approach to food production was needed, something never attempted before, and that could easily adapt to the significant difficulties that were to come. The answer was to create a true agricultural vault, a botanical laboratory, a closed ecosystem where new crops could be developed, suitable for implementation in a wide variety of fields: edible plants, medicinal herbs, new crops resistant to extreme conditions, and insect infestations. And all this even without direct natural sunlight. To achieve the best possible results, the families gathered in 22 were unlike any other. Their ranks included botanists, biologists, and agronomists, all specialized researchers brought together with the aim of having the best minds working on the project. Not ordinary people, but scientists who believed in progress, and above all, that their work would help save the world. And for a while, they were right. The discovery. The vault's first years were a success. Research was conducted intelligently and meticulously, and results were soon forthcoming. Records found inside the shelter reflect the scientists' enthusiasm. Initial reports speak of abundant harvests, efficient hydroponic systems, and successfully developed new plant varieties. The researchers' ideas were slowly taking shape, and the project was progressing at full speed. In a very short time, the vault was not simply self-sustaining, but was actually more productive. The new plants proved far more effective than anyone had imagined, with characteristics even exceeding those expected. They were disease-resistant, capable of growing even in sterile soil, and capable of surviving hostile environmental conditions. They had all the characteristics Vault-Tec had requested and more, so much so that there was soon talk of using them to recolonize the surface in a very short time. But unfortunately, like almost everything in the world of Fallout, things soon began to go wrong. And it all began, as often happens, with something small and seemingly insignificant, so much so that it went unnoticed until it was too late. Part of the projects planned to support Vault 22's research consisted of conducting short but regular reconnaissance missions of the outside world, searching for new plants grown in the radioactive environment, to study their mutations and perhaps implement their new qualities into the programs. But another portion of the case studies in the greenhouse came from external contractors, either from the government or Vault-Tec. One of these was the X-22 Botanical Garden at the Big Mountain Research and Development Center, a large industrial research center under the Ministry of Defense. From there, a very particular specimen arrived: Beauveria mordicana, the spore of an entomopathogenic fungus created with the aim of controlling infestations of insects harmful to crops. An extraordinary life form, not exactly a mushroom, but not a plant either. Something completely different, and with properties never seen before, so much so that it immediately became the key study element of the entire experiment. The original effect of the spore was to infest the harmful subject. The fungal colony expanded extremely rapidly, so much so that the victim succumbed within 10 to 20 days. Furthermore, this solution was particularly effective the larger the insect colony, resulting in an extremely high rate of diffusion. However, the spore did not appear to follow any biological rules known to scientists. It was capable of surviving even the most extreme environments, growing in any condition, even starting from completely sterile conditions, and above all, in complete deprivation of sunlight. But the very decision to bring it into the vault for more detailed study was the fatal mistake that triggered the ruin of the entire shelter. And naturally, no one recognized it as such. The initial experiments were astonishing. The spore revealed almost miraculous abilities. They revitalized plants previously thought to be dead, further accelerated the growth rate of all crops, and dramatically improved overall agricultural yields. Unlike many of its peers, this spore did not destroy, but enhanced, and its applications seemed endless. The spore. What scientists underestimated, however, was the organism's ability to spread. The spore was in fact capable of infecting not only insects, but virtually every living thing. The first cases, as often happens, were ignored. They were dismissed as simple colds or similar illnesses. Blame was placed on the stress of isolation, the underground life with little exposure to the sun, or perhaps a few malfunctions in the recycled air. But it didn't take long for the symptoms to begin to worsen. The first certified case was Dr. Harrison Peters, who personally documented the progression of the symptoms on his body. It all began with an anomalous pneumonia, caused by the spread of fungi into the respiratory tract. Then came fever, chills, and a terrible cough. All this led to a loss of lucidity, so much so that reality and hallucinations began to blend together. An abnormal increase in anger and aggression followed, and the next step was physical changes. Strange spots on the skin, growths, and a strange plant-like odor. But worse, the spore proved resistant to antifungal treatments, triggering an immune response in the host, which consequently rejected the drugs. By the time doctors, concerned about this strange epidemic, began isolating the sick, it was already too late. Because even though the spore was contagious, it was unlike anything scientists had ever encountered. And by that point, unnoticed, it had already spread everywhere. When they began performing the first analyses on infected tissue from the sick, the doctors made a terrifying discovery. The spore's proliferation process had led it to infiltrate the human body through the respiratory tract and lungs. From there, it had attached itself to the subject's nervous systems, where it began to propagate, using the entire body of the infected as a living incubator. But what was even more frightening was that the spore didn't seem to lead to the death of the infected. On the contrary, it kept its victim in a lifelike state and in health, causing it to change so as to become its ideal environment for development. Little by little, it transformed the inhabited body. Plant cells bonded with animal cells, leaving the brain active and even consciousness intact, albeit only partially. The victims were therefore still alive and perfectly capable of understanding what was happening to them, but their transformation became more and more irreversible and drastic day by day. Thus, the infected became what we now call spore carriers. Not exactly zombies, but not mutants either. They had become hybrids, half human and half plant. Some are still self-conscious. They speak, even ask for help, but their minds have been compromised, and now they have come to worship the spore as if it were a kind of deity. Plants began to grow on their bodies, or rather, from within their bodies, emerging from the chest, the back, and even the face. They have now become specially modified supports to encourage plant growth, and the spore has become their master, almost as if it had its own will and responded to a categorical command to expand. The vault splits. At this point, the vault split into two clear factions. One group of researchers recognized they had stumbled upon something too dangerous and far beyond their control. They believed the only reasonable solution was to abort the spore study, set fire to the remaining samples, and permanently seal the infected levels before the contamination spread to the rest of the shelter. But the other group of researchers saw the spore as an invaluable resource, a discovery that would revolutionize many scientific fields and lead humanity to a bright new future outside the vaults. Some even went so far as to argue that the spore was a new life form never before seen, and that it had the potential to lead humanity to a new evolutionary leap. Soon, the two factions, unable to find a compromise or an alternative solution, clashed. At first, they were only minor conflicts, brief tensions, small acts of sabotage in the laboratories. But then the violence began, escalating into outright murder. One by one, the security systems failed, and the lower levels were finally abandoned to the mercy of vegetation and the rampaging spore carriers. Suddenly, the vault ceased to be a cohesive community and became a biological battlefield. As the conflict escalated, someone finally decided to make a definitive decision. The infected population had to be stopped before every single human in the vault was permanently contaminated. A powerful incendiary gas was injected into the lower levels where the spore carriers were confined, with the express intent of exterminating them. But, as usual, things didn't go as planned. There's no precise information on the matter, but it seems that the first gas blast triggered an extremely violent response from the infected population, likely driven by the spore trying to protect itself. The creatures responded by breaching the vault's defenses and attacking anyone in their path, thus decimating the number of surviving scientists. A second gas attack was likely planned, but the spore carrier's unexpected response prevented it from being activated. Following this episode, the last remaining scientists decided to abandon the purification project, deemed too dangerous to be implemented. Therefore, the only alternative was to seal the vault and abandon it forever, in the hope that this measure would be sufficient to prevent the evil it contained from reaching the surface. Inside, only the infected remained, reduced to zombie-like beings devoid of any sense of purpose, or, in some cases, even mere colonies of stationary mold, albeit still alive. The fate of the scientists. But what happened to the survivors after their escape? It was 2096. The bombs had fallen more than 20 years earlier, and the former vault inhabitants found themselves battling an environment that was healing, but still largely contaminated by the radioactive fallout. For months, they traveled north in search of a place less affected by the apocalypse, until they arrived in Utah, in Zion Canyon. The site was strategically located, far from the main points of interest where the attacks had occurred, and its natural conformation had partially protected it from the radioactive winds. It seemed an ideal place to settle, except for one problem. It was already inhabited. A group of survivors from Mexico had crossed into the US and settled in the canyon a few years earlier. Perhaps in another similar situation, a peaceful coexistence solution would have been possible. But the scientists were now partially corrupted by the spore and, controlled by it, had much darker interests. Instead of seeking diplomatic contact, they decided on a direct attack. The vault survivors were superior in numbers, in better physical condition, armed and trained. It was literally a massacre, in which not even women and children were spared. The few remaining Mexican survivors were captured and taken to the enemy camp where they were imprisoned like cattle. However, what the scientists didn't know was that their deplorable actions had not gone unnoticed. Someone, another canyon dweller, had been studying the attack from afar. It was Randall Clark, a former US soldier who had been living alone in a local cave for years, and who had often secretly helped the Mexican population in the difficult task of surviving in that wild environment. Determined to rescue the prisoners, the man observed the enemy camp for 2 days, trying to find a way to infiltrate their ranks unseen. The first thing he noticed was the strange illness that seemed to be gripping the entire community. Everyone was afflicted with a chronic cough, but the man assumed it was some respiratory disease, like tuberculosis. He decided to ignore it, believing there was no way to exploit it at the moment. He also soon discovered that the scientists' security systems were rigid and difficult to circumvent. The group was extremely organized, with constant patrols and sentries stationed at strategic points. But there was a blind spot. The stream that flowed through the camp was partially out of sight of the enemy soldiers, and for short periods, the patrol was unable to cover that area. In a few days, the man gathered the equipment he had available and planned his rescue mission. But after a complex and dangerous infiltration operation, when he finally managed to reach the place where the prisoners were being held, the horror he encountered was beyond his wildest dreams. The former inhabitants of the vault, their minds now almost completely subjugated by the spore's will, had killed all the remaining Mexicans in order to feed on their bodies. Overwhelmed by anguish and rage at having failed to save the prisoners, Clark decided to begin a full-blown war of attrition against the attackers. Using his rifle and every tactic he knew, he began to exterminate the enemy soldiers, ambushing them, mining the areas they frequented, and stealing any weapons he could find useful. By the end of the month, he managed to kill more than 20 enemies without ever being discovered. Only once was he forced to retreat and subsequently move his hideout after being discovered by a scouting party. On that occasion, he detonated the area, killing some of the intruders as well. He was even wounded by a stray bullet, but fortunately, it wasn't fatal. In just under a year, the mysterious assassin had decimated the population of the former vault dwellers. Of the 118 who had escaped the shelter, just over 20 were still alive. But that wasn't the only misfortune that befell the group. The spore's mutation had now reached a critical point, and the infected had even begun feeding on the corpses of their fallen comrades in the grip of a ravenous need. Now reduced to the limit and unable to defend themselves from the attacker, they finally decided to abandon the canyon as well. From this point on, we have virtually no further news of them. In the contemporary game world, the last clues to their fate come from details the developers have scattered along our path. The Sorrows tribe, the current occupants of the Zion Canyon, demonstrate their familiarity with the Vault 22 residents through stories passed down orally by someone they call the Father in the Caves. This is likely the name behind Randall Clark. In the same caves near their camp, paintings can be found depicting Clark himself battling figures with skulls for heads and large number 22s on their bodies. In any case, their final fate is completely unknown, but given some corpses found and the sighting of bandits wearing clothing and equipment from Vault 22, we can assume they met a violent end at the hands of some armed gang. Vault 22 today. But if this was what happened to the inhabitants of Vault 22, what can we say about the shelter itself? After the scientists escaped, the place remained sealed for years, but the spore was still there, silent and industrious. Over time, it had literally taken over the entire vault. Plants proliferated everywhere, climbing the walls and ceiling, and the spores floated in midair, perfectly visible. Unfortunately, what remained of the former inhabitants still roamed the dark corridors, ready to attack and contaminate unwary visitors, unaware of the danger that the place posed. The vault wasn't dead, but rather more alive than ever. Of course, in a way far different from what Vault Tech and the scientists could ever have imagined. It had transformed into a perfect greenhouse, far beyond anything botanists could ever have achieved, even if the price paid was immense. The player can reach its entrance in several ways, but the key quest to unravel its story is There Stand the Grass, unlocked by visiting the Office of Science and Industry at Camp McCarran. Here, we'll meet Dr. Thomas Hildern, director of the Post, on behalf of the New California Republic. He will propose an expedition to Vault 22 to search for data on the research being conducted there, which he believes could revolutionize farming methods and even save the Republic from the severe food shortages plaguing it. What the researcher fails to mention, however, is that several other explorers had already been sent there, but none had ever returned. Upon reaching the vault, the player will find thick vegetation covering the area and signs indicating the presence of the shelter. However, these signs also carry ominous warnings painted in red. Stay out, the plants kill. Evidently, the shelter had already been opened previously, and the spore's effects had reached the surrounding area, causing plants to proliferate so much that the entrance was partially obscured. Inside, the entire series of horrors that had been locked away there many years before will be found. But not only that, a survivor of the previous recovery groups will also be present, Keeley, a ghoul scientist sent before us by Hildern to gather information on the research. The woman will be grateful for our help, and, once rescued, will allow us to activate the ventilation pumps containing the flammable gas that has remained dormant since the vault was sealed. Using the gas will completely cleanse the lower floors of the spore's influence, effectively purifying the shelter. But at this point, the player will find themselves at a crossroads. A difficult choice will have to be made, the same one the original inhabitants of the vault had to face. You can, as Keeley herself advised, decide to destroy the data sought by Dr. Hildern. The spore is clearly too dangerous to risk being reproduced in the outside world. The scientists who studied it met a terrible fate, and it would be foolish not to learn from their mistake. Alternatively, you can decide to return the information to the researcher. After all, learning from past mistakes is precisely what allows science to progress, and by knowing the mistakes made, you could truly use the spore to allow humanity to thrive. The choice lies solely with the player's morality. Believe in science, believe in humanity, or admit that some things simply aren't meant to be controlled. There's no sure answer, but after all, that's the beauty of Fallout, the true horror of Vault 22. The story of Vault 22 is not simply a tale of ruin. It demonstrates how destructive scientific research can become when pursued without a foundation of ethics. The relentless pursuit of progress at all costs, like a blind frenzy toward new, unexplored heights, must be guided by a strong moral compass. Otherwise, it can only lead humanity to ruin. The scientists of Vault 22 attempted to shape the world to their needs, and were succeeding. But when they pushed too far beyond that threshold, their desire backfired, and ultimately, nature itself rebelled against their attempts. What the researchers had forgotten is that scientific research does not aim to harness nature, but to understand it so we can then engage in dialogue with it. Trying to force nature to adapt our vision can lead to consequences that ripple through time, and the very bridge we've built toward a solid future can crumble beneath our feet unexpectedly. The specialists who inhabited the shelter are a prime example of this. The repercussions of their ambition were horrifying. They didn't die, they became something else. Suspended in midair, not alive, but no longer human either. And this is probably the most terrifying fate that can befall the world of Fallout. When opening the doors of a vault, one must always be careful. Those thick steel barriers were built to keep the world out of the shelters. But as time passes, there's no telling what fate the bizarre creatures within may have been. And sometimes, those same protections may have become the last bastions of resistance against the proliferation of new, dark evils. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the most disturbing secrets in Fallout, click the video on screen now.